Deep in the heart of an ancient English woodland, nestled amongst towering oaks and whispering pines, stands a single, unassuming cabin. From the outside, it looks like any other rustic retreat-worn timber, a moss-covered roof, a curl of smoke from a stone chimney. It seems peaceful, a perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of modern life. But this little cabin holds a secret, a story steeped in a century of conflict, a tale of four families locked in a relentless battle for ownership. This isn't just a story about property, it's the story of the Cabin War. Our story begins over 100 years ago with four distinct families: the Ashworths, the Blackwoods, the Clayburns, and the Drakes. Each family, through a tangled web of ancestry, forgotten wills, and handshake deals, held a legitimate, albeit overlapping, claim to this very cabin. The Ashworths, known for their sharp legal minds, possessed a deed so old the ink was fading. The Blackwoods, master craftsmen who claimed their ancestors built the cabin with their own hands, had generations of sworn testimony. The Clayburns, a family of wealthy merchants, had a purchase agreement from a long-lost heir. And the Drakes, with their deep connection to the land and local folklore, argued their right was granted by the forest itself. In the early days, the conflict was one of polite but firm letters, then heated arguments in dusty lawyers' offices. But as the years rolled on, politeness frayed, the war escalated. It wasn't a war of armies and generals, but a silent, cunning battle fought in the shadows of the woods. One week, the Ashworths would find their newly installed locks mysteriously glued shut. The next, the Blackwoods would discover their carefully stacked firewood had been borrowed and used to spell out Clayburn and the clearing. The Drakes, more subtle, would use their knowledge of the forest to create phantom noises and eerie lights, hoping to spook the others away. Sabotage became an art form. Legal challenges were a constant drain on everyone's resources. It was a war of attrition, of clever tricks and petty vengeance, a feud passed down from parent to child like a cursed inheritance. Through all this, through a century of squabbling, scheming, and outright hostility, something remarkable happened. Or rather, something remarkable didn't happen. The cabin remained untouched by time. While the world outside changed, with wars, inventions, and the march of progress, the cabin stood defiant. Its timbers never rotted, the roof never leaked. The windows, somehow, never broke. It was as if the structure existed in a bubble, pristine and perfect, just as it was when it was first built. The families, so consumed by their fight, barely noticed this strange anomaly at first. They were too busy plotting their next move to focus on winning the war. But you see, this cabin wasn't just a sturdy building. It held a power, a deep and ancient magic that the feuding families had yet to understand. The cabin was a place of healing, not just for splinters and bruises, but for the mind and the soul. Anyone who spent time within its walls, even for a short while, would feel a profound sense of peace wash over them. Worries would melt away, anxieties would quiet, and old emotional wounds would begin to mend. It was a sanctuary, a place that could soothe the most troubled spirit. The irony was cosmic. The very object of their century-long war was the one thing that could have healed the generational bitterness that fueled it. But none of them had ever stayed long enough, or with a peaceful enough heart, to discover its true gift. After 100 years of relentless struggle, the end of the war was finally in sight. It came down to one final, epic contest. The families, exhausted and nearly bankrupt from a century of legal fees and sabotage, agreed to a winner-take-all challenge. It was a complex scavenger hunt, a test of wit, endurance, and knowledge of the forest and its history. It was the Great Cabin Gambit. Each family chose their champion, the best and brightest of their current generation. For the Ashworths, it was Eleanor, a brilliant lawyer with a photographic memory. For the Blackwoods, it was Finn, a strong and resourceful carpenter who knew the woods like the back of his hand. The Clayburns sent Julian, a cunning strategist with a knack for puzzles. And the Drakes chose Willow, a quiet and intuitive young woman who seemed to speak the language of the forest. The gambit was grueling. It lasted for 3 days and 3 nights, pushing the champions to their absolute limits. They deciphered riddles etched into ancient stones, navigated by the stars, and followed cryptic clues left by their ancestors. The rivalry was fierce. Eleanor used legal loopholes in the rules to her advantage. Finn built clever contraptions to overcome obstacles. Julian employed misdirection and decoys to lead his rivals astray. Willow used her deep connection to nature to find shortcuts others missed. They were evenly matched, each family's strengths playing out in a real-life chess game. The final challenge was to find a hidden key, the original key to the cabin, said to be lost for a century. The final clue led them to a hollow in the oldest oak tree at the edge of the clearing. All 4 champions arrived at the same time, panting and exhausted. A frantic scramble ensued, a tangle of limbs and desperate grabs. And in the chaos, it was Julian Clayburn, through a final, audacious act of trickery, who snatched the key. He held it aloft, a triumphant grin on his face. The Clayburns had won. The war was over. According to the agreement, the losers were to relinquish their claims forever and never set foot in the woods again. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The Ashworths, the Blackwoods, and the Drakes packed their family histories, their hopes, and their century of resentment, and departed. For the first time in 100 years, the woods fell silent. Julian Clayburn, representing his victorious family, unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside, the sole and undisputed owner. He breathed a deep sigh of satisfaction, victory, but the cabin had other plans. It had watched the war for 100 years, and it had a sense of justice and a sense of humor all its own. As Julian settled in, preparing to enjoy the spoils of his family's long-fought victory, a strange warmth filled the room. It wasn't just the fire in the hearth, it was something more, a gentle, pervasive energy that seemed to hum from the very walls. He felt the profound peace he'd only ever glimpsed before. His competitive edge softened, his cunning mind grew quiet. He felt content, and then he felt something else. A flicker of movement outside the window. He looked out and his jaw dropped. Standing in the clearing, looking just as confused as he felt, were Eleanor Ashworth, Finn Blackwood, and Willow Drake. They hadn't walked back. They hadn't broken the agreement. They had simply reappeared. One moment they were miles away, starting new lives free from the cabin's shadow. The next, they were right back where they started, drawn by an invisible force they couldn't comprehend. The cabin had brought them back. Its magic, its healing power was not meant for just one person or one family. It was a gift for all of them. The cabin didn't want a winner, it wanted peace. It had decided that if the families wouldn't share it willingly, it would simply make it impossible for them not to. It tethered them to the land, to itself, and to each other. And so, the war didn't end. It simply changed. The battle for ownership was over, but a new, more complicated challenge had begun. The challenge of coexistence. The 4 families, now bound to the cabin by a force they couldn't fight, had to learn to live with each other. The old rivalries still simmered, of course. Arguments would break out over who got to use the cabin on a holiday weekend or whose turn it was to chop the wood. Old habits die hard, but something was different. Spending time in the cabin, they couldn't help but be affected by its healing aura. The peace it offered began to seep into their bones, softening the hard edges of their ancestral feud. Eleanor would find herself having a civil conversation with Finn about structural integrity. Julian would share a pot of tea with Willow, listening to her stories about the forest's secrets. They were still rivals in a way. The war wasn't over. But it was no longer a war of sabotage and bitterness. It had become a war of witty banter, of competitive baking, of seeing who could tell the best ghost story around the fire. The cabin had won in the end. It had brought its warring children home and forced them to become what they were always meant to be, a single, dysfunctional, but ultimately inseparable family. Some wars never truly end, they just evolve. And in the heart of an ancient English wood, the cabin war rages on, fueled now not by hate, but by a strange, magical, and begrudging love. Thank you so much for watching. What do you think the cabin would do next? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure. See you next time.